Good evening, this is Quintus Curtius, and we're back here with the podcast. It's been a few weeks since I've done a podcast, maybe even about a month or so, I can't remember exactly, but I like to stay off the mic unless I have something to say. There's a need for a lot less talk in the world, so that was my operative principle here, but I do have something to say now. I just finished a book recently, a few days ago, a very good book. It's called The Black Russian by Vladimir Alexandrov. And it's a very interesting biography. It's a biography of a Black American businessman who, in the early 20th century, he spent many years in Europe, France, and then, first I think England and then France, and then he emigrated to czarist Russia in the years before the revolution. And he became a very, very successful restaurateur, nightclub owner, entertainer, and made a huge fortune for himself, became a Russian citizen. But then things started to go badly. The Russian Revolution intervened, the Bolsheviks took power, and then things went downhill from there. So we'll talk about his life and some of the conclusions that we can draw from his life, because his life saw extreme highs and extreme lows. And so it's very illustrative of some of the principles that we've talked about here in the past about the favorable qualities of fortune and also the rapidity with which fortune's favor can be withdrawn. And these are things that we should be constantly reflecting on, because here we like to study the lives of great men and we like to try to learn what we can from them. And that's what we're going to do here in this podcast. And I'll post a link on my site when I post this podcast. I'll post a link to the book on Amazon, so if anyone wants to acquire it, they can very, very easily do that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this gentleman. His name again is Frederick Bruce Thomas, and he came from a very interesting background, about as many obstacles as in his background as one can imagine. You know, he grew up. His parents were his family was from the Mississippi Delta, and the book makes it clear that this was pretty much the most southern place in the country. And he was born in 1872 to former slaves in Mississippi, and I guess the county they were from was Coahoma, Coahoma. And so, from the first, this gentleman had some very interesting qualities. What was very unusual for his family in those days was they happened to be very wealthy. They happened to be very land rich. His parents had acquired a 200-acre farm in 1869. And that was the author makes it clear that was a very rare thing in those days for former slaves to have that much land, especially in the Mississippi Delta. So somehow, I forget exactly how they came into it, or they bought it, or I'm not sure exactly how. I suppose I could look it up, but they acquired it. They were generous. His parents donated, I guess, in 1879, some land to establish one of the first African Methodist Episcopal churches. And they were beset by troubles, just like anyone would be. In 1866, there was a wealthy white landowner who tried to cheat them out of their land through a complicated scheme. And the Thomases fought back in court, which was not something that normally happened. These were intelligent people. They knew how to fight. And they actually won. They fought back in court. They sued to recover their land. But the other party who lost appealed it to the Mississippi Supreme Court in 1890, and I think basically by that time they realized that long drawn-out litigation, they just didn't have the energy or the money, or they would have been somehow hounded out of town one way or another. So they moved to Memphis, and this is where tragedy struck Frederick Thomas's family. His father was... This is awful. I mean, his father was a landlord, and I guess he took on a couple tenants, some tenants, and one of whom was basically a psychopath. And he got into some spats with this guy, And eventually, this man murdered him. I guess he came into his room at night with a hatchet and just murdered him in his sleep. Terrible, terrible story. So the man was gunned down by police, I guess, trying to leave town, trying to escape town. So obviously, like a lot of travelers and a lot of adventurers that we've explored the lives of many adventurers and travelers in articles on our site here at Fortress of the Mind in the past, and I see Thomas as fitting into that mold of the traveler and adventurer, the explorer. And one of the things that we've noticed and commented about in the past is that a lot of these explorers and travelers, they have baggage in their past. They've had some trauma. They've had some bad experiences, and clearly having your father brutally murdered, in Memphis, and before that having your family cheated out of land. That's the type of thing that can leave a very, very bad taste in someone's mouth. So understandably, Mr. Thomas decided to seek greener pastures, and apparently he was given the idea to leave by, I guess, friends he had, or I think teachers that he came into contact with. He first went to Chicago, then Brooklyn, New York, but finally he left for Europe in 1894. 1894, he left for Europe, and he kind of bounced around the continent. And I guess it's clear Frederick Thomas had some skills, some very, very good skills, but personal, social skills. He knew how to charm people. He knew how to size people up. He was very good at providing, waiting, valet services, waiter services, and those skills were in high demand. I think they were then, and I think they still are now. If you know how to cater to people, and it is a skill, if you know how to make people feel comfortable and you know how to make them feel like they need you, then you're going to do very, very well. So he knew how to. He slowly built up his fortune. He set aside his savings. He married a German woman at some point, and at some point he decided to go to. I guess he had ingratiated himself with some Russian nobleman, and eventually he left for Moscow. And then he found, he found himself a novelty really in many parts of Europe and also Russia. As an American black man, it's clear that he was a novelty. And in life, you have to use the advantages you have. And if you're somewhere where you're in high demand, then you need to make use of those skills. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's certainly something that everyone does or should do. But he was more than that. He was not just he was not just an interesting novelty or an interesting face. He also had some very, very astute business talents here, and it's clear from the biography that he did. He's basically, to make a long story short, he set up some entertainment gardens, one called Aquarium, another one, a restaurant called Yar, Y-A-R. And these places catered to the very, very wealthy class of citizens in Moscow. And then, as now, wealthy people like to entertain themselves. They like to spend money when they go out. And if you can position yourself to be at that place, you can do very, very well for yourself. And clearly, if you have a stomach for risk, because the hospitality industry is risky. It's boom or bust. Some places make it, some places do not. So in 1912, Thomas reinvested his profits. Well, he basically, came into a variety theater that he called a Maxim, and it became a favorite of the hip crowd in Moscow. Now, when war broke out in 1914, this is where things, eventually. So, bottom line is, in Russia, Frederick Thomas made himself a fortune. He had everything that a man could want. He had a successful business. He had money. He had a wife. He had probably mistresses. He had a family. He had children. He had everything a man could want. And yet somehow, as we've said before, the universe always has a way of finding you, of honing in on you, seeking you out and say, there you are. I know where you've been hiding. And now I'm going to teach you a little bit about suffering. I'm going to teach you a little bit about what it's like to be on the other side of the tracks. And this is where things, and again, I'm going to let you be the judge of what, sometimes it's not even really anyone's fault. It's not really the fault of the individual. Sometimes events can just conspire to undermine us. But where things started to get interesting was when war broke out, Frederick Thomas made the fateful decision to become a Russian citizen. He officially decided to become a citizen of the Empire of Russia. Now, this is a fateful decision, and it's not clear. The author, I think, either could not figure out the reasons why, or either does not want to discuss the reasons why. But it's clear, I think anyone that knows anything about working abroad knows there would have been significant benefits probably for him claiming Russian citizenship at a time of heightened nationalism in Europe, at a time of national war fervor. It probably would have been a very effective thing for him to do this. It probably would have been a very useful thing for him to do this, to shield himself from the scrutiny that foreigners naturally get. So it's understandable. And I'm also guessing that being a citizen of the country he had lived in for over, a decade or so, or, almost 15 years, being a citizen of that country would have given him some advantages. Perhaps being a Russian citizen would maybe give you a tax breaks, or maybe give you advantages on leases or renting land or owning property, or there would have been any number of financial and practical reasons for him to do this. Okay, and that's fine. However, we always need to remind ourselves that nothing comes for free, that taking that step opens you up to consequences. And when a person renounces his or her citizenship of one country and takes on the citizenship of another country, very often they don't know what they're giving up. Very often that decision can have very, very fateful consequences. And in Frederick Thomas's case, that decision had very dire consequences that he probably never suspected. Now, the other, thing that I think he probably could have done better is he apparently never made any attempt to get any of his money out of Russia. He apparently kept it all there. He was fluent in French, probably. He was fluent in French and probably had a rudimentary knowledge of German. Apparently was competent in Russian or fluent in Russian. It's not really clear. I think he could speak functional Russian. I think full literacy he may not have had that. But regardless, he could conduct himself, take care of business in Russian. But he apparently never made any attempt to try to get his money out of the country or to try to put it in foreign bank accounts to shield him, because, frankly, the Russian Empire was looking very, very rickety even before World War I. I think any prescient observer could tell, or should have been able to tell, that the Russian Empire was on its last legs. It had been defeated by Japan seriously in 1905. It had been shattered, really, and there had been a revolution in the country. So that type of thing could have or should have alerted him to the fact that, maybe my days here are going to be numbered. Maybe I should take steps to get the hell out of Dodge. But that never occurred to him. Again, it's easy for me to say this. I know in hindsight, things always look perfectly clear in hindsight. But my point is that if you are going to live abroad, you need to keep your pulse on events. You need to be mindful of what's going on around you, so that when the shit hits the fan, you can not be left holding the bag. So anyway, he took on Russian citizenship, and the author makes it clear again in the book that Frederick Thomas had ulterior motives for taking on Russian citizenship. Before war broke out, he never really had a compelling reason to do that. But once war was declared, suddenly he discovered his love for Russia and decided to take on citizenship. It was probably a practical decision to protect himself from unwanted scrutiny there as a foreigner. Now, there was another problem as well, and this would have fateful consequences later. Frederick Thomas concealed his decision to renounce his American citizenship from the American authorities. He never told anyone. And I'm reading right from the book here. This is on page 114. He says, Frederick concealed from the American authorities that he had decided to become a Russian citizen. The Moscow Governor General's office and the Russian Imperial Ministry of the Interior did not inform the Americans either. As a result, neither the American Consulate General in Moscow, nor the embassy in Petrograd, nor the State Department in Washington, D.C. ever found out that Frederick Bruce Thomas had officially expatriated himself. This would have two remarkable consequences. 4 years later in Odessa, during what were some of the most perilous days of his life, he would be able to save himself and his family by concealing that he had formally surrendered his American citizenship. And in 1931, 3 years after his death, his two youngest sons, who were born in Russia, would be recognized as Americans on the strength of their father's non-existent American citizenship at that time, and only because the State Department did not know that he had given up his American citizenship in Moscow. So, what does that mean? What that means is that you can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. He decided to give up his American citizenship to become a Russian citizen, and that's fine. Everyone has a right to do what they want. But understand, that has consequences. And in his case, it would have fateful consequences for him. On the other hand, the fact that he concealed it from the American authorities actually helped his sons later. It enabled in 1931 his sons to get American citizenship, which they never should have been able to do because his father had renounced his American citizenship. In Odessa, he was frankly able to dodge the issue of renouncing his American citizenship by saying he lost all his paperwork. So the bottom line is, I bring this up only to point out the fact that you can't have it both ways. And it's true that, he was given a hard time when he escaped to Turkey. But, then again, a lot of that was because he was also evasive, and he was also not being straight with the authorities either. And so some things he got benefits from and some things he did not get benefits from. So anyway, that was the situation. And he stayed in Moscow during the war years. And as everyone knows, in 1917, things went south in a big way in Russia. The czarist government collapsed. The government changed hands several times between the provisional government, and then the communists finally took power in 1918. And as a wealthy bourgeois foreigner, obviously he was a prime target of the revolutionary government, the Bolshevik government. So he, along with everybody else who had any money, had to get the hell out of Dodge. They had to flee. And they had to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. It's a terrible story, very, very tragic story. So he made a fortune in Moscow and had to abandon everything, and he had to escape with his life and with the clothes on his back. First he went to Odessa on the Black Sea, and then from there made his way to Turkey, to Constantinople. And obviously that was not really an ideal place to be either at that time, because Turkey was going through its own upheavals. It had lost the war as a member of the Central Powers, and it was in the process of undergoing its own internal revolutions. Now, what does that mean? Well, when Frederick Thomas got to Constantinople, he presented himself to the American authorities, and he never told them that he had renounced his U.S. citizenship. And he tried to say that he was an American, and frankly, he lied to them. He told them that he was an American, he wanted to get out of there, that he had business interests in Russia, blah, 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 blah. But he didn't have the right paperwork. So this guy there is some 28-year-old consulate official, a guy named Allen. I forget what his first name is, Allen. This guy looks like, he had to fill out a passport application and an affidavit to explain protracted foreign residence abroad. And it's clear that this consulate, this government official, didn't like Mr. Thomas. I think he probably suspected he was evasive. He probably suspected that Thomas had already renounced his U.S. citizenship. And Thomas, filled out the applications with, numerous omissions and evasions and just a lot of. He didn't do himself any favors. Okay, he told him that he was considering he had financial interests in France. So the bottom line is, it's not clear exactly, the interactions between these two, but clearly, the consulate did not trust Frederick Thomas, and I guess they set his application aside for like 14 months. They just buried it, and one could say, well, that was because of his own antagonism towards this guy, or one could say simply because Frederick Thomas was not being honest. It was probably a combination of both. So, again, here again, as a reader, 100 years after the fact, you say to yourself, the smart move at that point would have been for him just to go back to France. I mean, if he was a Russian citizen, why not just why stay in Turkey? That seems to be one of the worst places to go. Why not go to a developed Western country? And he already spoke French fluently. He had been successful in France in the past. The post-war years in France were actually quite prosperous once the 1920s got rolling. And I think he probably could have done very well if he had just gone back to France. But for some reason, he didn't. And again, one scratches one's head and says, man, you made a bad move here, man. Instead of trying to go back to the U.S., where even if he had gone back to the U.S., the author makes it clear he would have not been able to enjoy the same standard of living that he would have had in Europe. There was still a lot of exclusionary, Jim Crow laws. He would have been subjected to institutionalized discrimination, and it just doesn't seem like a good move at that point. But then again, people have their own reasons why they do things, and he did what he did. But the bottom line is, he could not, his request for an American passport was never approved. So he was kind of stuck in Turkey as a man without a country, because again, he couldn't really go back. Obviously, he couldn't go back to Russia. And he really didn't want anyone to acknowledge his Russian citizenship. So he kind of became a man without a nation. But he still did very well for himself in Turkey, at least at first. At first, he took on a couple partners. He did well. He set up restaurants and nightclubs in Turkey. And the first few years of the post-war period in Turkey were not bad. There was an appetite for foreign type of entertainment, for nightclubs that served alcohol with live shows, things like that. And he did very well. He got established. He was sort of recouping his fortune. But then, a combination of bad environment, competition, and just the political conditions just conspired against him. Number one, other nightclubs began to open up that were able to attract wealthier patrons that siphoned off his clients. Also, the political conditions in Turkey at that time were just not favorable for foreigners. There was a lot of xenophobia. There was a lot of nationalist sentiment. The authorities would find all sorts of excuses to shut you down and say you couldn't operate, you couldn't serve alcohol, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. It was just very, very difficult for a foreigner especially, to make a living. So he had that strike against him. And also, his creditors became very aggressive. Whereas in the past he often was given time to pay debts, his creditors became very aggressive, and they even started to contact the consulate and complain about him, which certainly did not endear him to the consular officials there. So things just got worse and worse for Frederick Thomas. And you read this and you just feel really bad for this guy. It's like, man, it's just the harder you work, it's like nothing just worked out for him at that point. And things only got worse. Eventually, his creditors, at some point, he just lost all of his money. No one would extend him credit anymore. His businesses began to shut down. He had to flee, essentially, Istanbul and go to another city. I think it was Ankara or some other city. I can't remember. But his creditors actually tracked him down, and he was put in debtor's prison. I guess Turkey at that time still had a debtor's prison system, and he was clapped into jail. And he was so he was so impoverished he couldn't even get out. He literally had not 2 nickels to rub together at that time. So very, very tragic. And he died essentially in debtor's prison, and he was only in his early 50s. And what's even worse is that fact that we don't even know the exact location of his grave. He was buried in a Catholic cemetery for foreigners. They know the grave. They know the cemetery where he is, but there's no headstone. No one could afford a headstone for him, so the precise location of his grave is just simply not known. And maybe that would be a project for some enterprising historiographer in the future to actually find that grave and give him some sort of headstone. But so that's the story. I mean, his sons were able to basically, they were able to use the fact that he had been born in the U.S. They were able to get U.S. citizenship basically by concealing the fact that their father had become a Russian citizen. No one looked at it too closely, so they were able to get some benefits, and his sons had careers in Europe. I think one of them came back to the U.S., but one became had a film career as a movie star, I think, or a film actor in Europe, I think in France. But a very, very interesting story. And I think the conclusions that we can draw from this as a student of travelers and explorers, we can say that, you've got to be aggressive in life. You've got to be enterprising. You've got to seek out new opportunities where you find them. But on the other hand, you can overthink things. You can get too cute. And don't ever get too cute, And I think the lesson that I learned is don't ever take your citizenship lightly. Don't ever do anything to renounce your citizenship. There are people that have these ideas. You can get a foreign passport and you can do this and you can do that. I'm not so sure that's even if you can do something. It's debatable whether you should do something like that, because taking on foreign passports. First, renouncing the citizenship of the country of your birth, I think, is just a mistake. Unless there's some extreme good reason to do that, I think that's always a bad move. And if you do it, you better damn well know what the consequences are going to be. But even something like taking on a second passport, I just don't think. I know there's some people, you're eligible for dual citizenship in some places. I don't, I know people that have done that. It's not something I would ever do. I just don't think. I just don't really know how much it's worth, if it really does anything, if it's useful. Now, of course, there are going to be people that hear this and say, "Oh no, it's a great thing, and I do it all the time." And okay, fine, whatever, that's fine. Good for you. Good for you. For me, that's not for me. I think, you got one home, you got one country, you got one home, and that's where you stake your claim. That's where you ground your flag. That's where you plant your seed. That's where you do your thing. And unless there's some damn good reason to deviate from that plan, that course of action, I think that's the right one to do, the right course of action to choose. Again, other people may think differently. It's just my opinion, and I think far too few people really understand the implications of giving up your citizenship or of taking on other nationalities. And that's just my thoughts. But anyway, it's a good book. It's should be read by any student of travel or exploration. Very motivating story. But there's good things too here. I think you learn that in life you have to use your advantages, and I think the sky's the limit if you really make use of your advantages. There's nothing. You should travel. People should travel. You should spend time abroad. You should spend time abroad. As often as you can in foreign countries. There's nothing wrong with that. But always keep yourself grounded. Never go too native. Never go too native, I think, is one of the lessons here to remember. So anyway, my thoughts. If you have different thoughts, feel free to share them. And until next time, this is Quintus Curtius. Good night.